Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to our concluding panel, which is called The Future of European Order, and I'll be happy to moderate a 24-hour session on a small topic like this, and I hope that you sort of stay with us all through this time. Well, actually, during the previous session, I've been thinking at a certain point, well, we could stop it right here. And that was when Gerlinde Niehuys and James Scher so nicely said, we have the better system and the European Union has never been in a better shape. Well, I would love to believe that, because then I would have loved to basically stop on this very optimistic note and say, well, if this is the case, why do we have to talk about the future of European order? But we know, of course, all of us know, of course, and we've heard this during this conference. I mean, we've been talking about defense matters. We've been talking about reaching a new level of competitiveness, economic competitiveness in Europe. We've been talking about the challenges by Russia. And we have quite a few more shocks to digest. I mean, after a Euro crisis, we've seen the Ukraine-Russia crisis, and only recently we've seen a refugee crisis, which definitely we'll be talking about here. And as a German, I would suggest kind of a Berlin model. And don't you think that I have German or Berlin leadership in mind here? What I have in mind is sort of Berlin architectural style as it has developed over the last 20, 25 years, which is an interesting one. Take, for example, the Reichstag. The Reichstag is a pretty pompous, Wilhelminic, slightly clunky building that served its purpose more or less in a more hybrid democratic empire until 1933, when it was set on fire by the Nazis. And then it was bombed, of course, during the Second World War. The Red Army conquered the Reichstag, thinking that the Reichstag was sort of the nucleus and the core of the Nazi empire, which it was, of course, not. It was rather the Reichskanzlei, but never mind, it started with Reichs. And then we had soldiers from the Red Army leaving their graffitis in the building. During the Cold War, it housed an exhibit on German history, and it was situated right at the wall. And after the war came down, and after really fervent discussion and debates, I can't believe that we really did this, whether the German government should move to Berlin, because I thought, well, of course, where else would they move to? Stay in Bonn or what? Of course they'd move to Berlin. There was a discussion also whether the Reichstag, with a heavy history like this, should house the German parliament, the Bundestag. And I was always thinking about, perhaps we should call it the Bundestag in the Reichstag building. But now it's just called the Reichstag. And why? Because a wonderful British architect by the name of Sir Norman Foster rebuilt it and put a glass dome on it, which is liked by everybody and gives some transparency to the Berlin Republic democracy, which is really nice to see, especially in the evenings. So what has become of the Reichstag? A clunky structure with a heavy history, but that includes different narratives of history in its very building and has become a symbol of democratic transparency. Now, this is what I like to suggest for the repair work we might have to do for the European Union. And having said that, I would like to introduce this formidable panel to you from far right, which of course doesn't have anything to do with political standings.
I hope so.
Prime Minister and Minister of Foreign Affairs and European Affairs of Slovakia, Mr. Miroslav Lajčák. Welcome. Thank you for coming here. Former Foreign Minister Carl Bildt, who is one of the most, not only a foreign politician, but also a Twitterati of some sorts. Thank you very much for coming here. And Jean-Marie Guéhenno, who is the head of the International Crisis Group. Prime Minister, I would like to ask the first question to you. I mean, we've been talking about the different forms of shocks and crises. And let's move our focus now on the latest of those crises, the refugee crises. We've seen, as we've already seen during the Euro crisis, that some of the construction work of the European Union was, to say the least, not very sufficient. We built a Eurozone without a fiscal union. Now, obviously, with the refugee crisis, we see that our Schengen and Dublin II frameworks are not really sufficient to take the shocks that we see right now with the refugees coming in masses. My question to you, of course, is how can we build a better structure, also when it comes to migration policy, that both fulfills the need to sort of have sovereignty over our European borders and to not undermine what Europe has most, and that is soft power, that does not undermine our value system.
I think we shall to recognize the fact that we are now living through a period when one world system, as we know it, the post-Cold War order, is coming to its end, and it will be replaced by something that is in the making. And these processes create lots of vacuum, which is being filled in by non-systemic players. And we're struggling to cope with it and to react to it. So the first step to answer your question is to understand where we are, what are the challenges we are facing. You mentioned some of the shortcomings of the European construction. I think the problem is that they were built for good times, with no crisis and with everyone inside of the European Union being honest and diligently playing by the rules. So the financial crisis was a first wake-up call in this regard, and we realized that our financial and economic architecture was not sufficient, but we managed to repair it, to add the pieces that were missing, and the system looks much better and it is in better shape now. When it comes to the current crisis with refugees and migration, well, we have Schengen, we have Dublin. They were not projected or designed for this scale of migration, but for me this is not the reason to abandon them. On the contrary, I mean, we really have to strengthen and to use all the instruments, and we have plenty of instruments, to put them in full use, because we have somehow very quickly abandoned the Schengen, and we act as if there is no Schengen, or as if there is no Schengen border. And Dublin is not working, but it does not mean it should be dismissed. I mean, unless we have come up with something better, which is not the case, then we have to stick to the rules and to the instruments that we have designed for ourselves. And the main precondition for all this is the European leadership, which we don't have. On the migration issue, I don't see European leadership. What I see is the panicking member states of the European Union who are taking steps to protect their own territory, their own interests, at the detriment of European Union as such. So as we are not protecting our external borders, we are building up fences and walls among and between the European Union member states, which is bad, because then we will end up really realizing that there is no longer Schengen, there is no longer Dublin, there is no longer freedom of movement, and there is nothing to discuss, nothing to talk about. So that's why we really need a realistic assessment of the situation and realistic policy solutions. And when it comes to this particular issue of migration and refugees, I'm still missing that. We are getting there. Our discussion compared to what it was 3 months ago is much more realistic. Now we are speaking about the real root causes. Let's hope we will turn our words into actions very soon.
I'll pass this question on in a minute to Carl Bildt, so Carl Bildt has 1 more minute to think about it. But can you be more specific on what exactly you want to keep about Schengen, and what do you mean by we've become more realistic about the root causes? You know, how do you want to keep member states from building their own fences and kind of protecting their own borders when the whole European idea was, let's do away with borders?
Let's do away with borders between the member states of the Schengen zone, but let's protect the Schengen zone so that we can feel safe and secure within the area.
What specific measures would you take, or should be taken?
Fill the gaps that are clearly there, namely the Greek border. So if Greece is unable to cope with the protection of their border, which is our own common Schengen border, let's help them. Send ships, send manpower, send money, send all kinds of the techniques that is needed. Help them, because we are helping ourselves. So, Schengen has never been projected to allow anyone to enter, to march into the European Union without being, asked what his name was. And we need to insist that we apply our rules. So what I say is that restore the Schengen as it is, check the people who are entering European territory before they have entered, because now we clearly see that no matter whether they have been accepted or rejected, they stay in the European Union. So that's the Schengen borders, registration, returns, better engagement with the countries of origin and countries of transit. And then the root causes. That means the reasons why these people are leaving their own countries and have decided to settle in European Union. So do you have 5 answers to it?
I will ask you later on what our European strategy on Syria is, because we'd be all curious to know. But Carl Bildt, same question goes to you. What exactly can we do and do we have to do to strengthen Schengen? In Germany, we've had a real big discussion about so-called hotspots, transit camps, etc., etc. Does this play a role in your thinking?
Well, I'd be kind and stay away from the German debate. But there are immense numbers of things that we need to do. I mean, more fundamental point from my point of view is that we've gone from a period where the narrative and the policy was really an expanding European order that we were building. Enlargement, neighborhood policy, soft power, and it gave us, for a couple of decades, some of the best decades we ever had in Europe, as a matter of fact. But now it's turned around. And now we have an escalating disorder that is intruding into our reality. Refugees, Russia, whatever. Disorder is intruding upon us. And the Europe that we built for the, call it the fair weather decades, although they were somewhat more difficult when you were in them than they look in retrospect, that will have to be rebuilt to some extent. And I'm, with one exception, rather optimistic. Because we've gone from a European Union that was perhaps for some time driven by sort of this federalist vision of sort of ever closer union, to take that particular phrase, by people, mostly men, delivering speeches in Aachen, talk about Charlemagne and reselect, and that sort of thing is gone. Now we have a Europe that is driven by the utter practical necessity by governments. There's not a prime minister in Europe who doesn't understand that he or she has to go to Europe for these endless painful meetings and try to forge a compromise, because the alternative to the painful meetings in Brussels is an even more painful reality back home, with the sort of escalating disorder in the surrounding world. All of the nations of Europe are far too small to manage. And then I think necessity will force them to do X numbers of things. I think we'll have a truly common asylum policy. I think we'll have a functioning border management system. I think we'll have, call it Dublin 3 or Bratislava 4 or whatever, it's going to be after X numbers of crisis meetings, for the simple reason that the alternative is far worse. I mean, the worst crisis that can hit, the worst thing that can happen to us is if Europe breaks apart. A fractured Europe is a substantially more dangerous Europe. And
a much more exposed Europe. I mean, we've just been talking about the Russia threat, we've been talking about another threat.
Absolutely. The precondition for handling all of the challenges and threats that we now face is the cohesion of Europe and the link across the Atlantic. Were that to break the one or the other, then even the possibility of managing the different challenges would disappear. And that is, to just a final point, the biggest danger that I see to our future is neither the meltdown of the Middle East, nor the revisionist, the reactionary Russia, but the UK leaving. Mm-hmm. Because that could initiate a process of fragmentation and breakup that would make all of the other crises virtually unmanageable.
Thank you for that, because we will come to this point of a potential Brexit later, and we will come to some other points. But I would like to ask Jean-Marie Guéhenno first, since Carl Bildt has been outlining so optimistically the threats that we might be facing as the head of the International Crisis Group. And could you sort of describe, in perhaps even an order of priority, or even anticipate some of the major threats that the European Union might face soon? So just that we get a bit more analytical clarity, what is it that we are up to?
Well, this morning we were discussing the differences between now and the Cold War. And President Ilves asked us to get real on Russia. I think we have to get real on ourselves, too. And in that sense, I think the first threat I would identify in a way is not the kind of threat that Crisis Group deals with. It's the threat within. And then I will very much follow on what Carl Bildt said. Because when I look at the key differences between now and the age of the Cold War, I think one key distinction is the age of the Cold War was structured by major ideological confrontation. Today, the world is unified in a way by one simple idea, which is the pursuit of money. And that has had very beneficial effects in many parts of the world. More people have been lifted out of poverty in the last 2 decades than in any other period in human history. That is a very good thing. But there are downsides to that. That creates vulnerabilities. It impacts on policies because we're all for sale, whether it's in the Middle East, whether it's in relations with Russia. It also creates leverage on Russia itself because Russia is much more integrated in today's economy than the Soviet Union was, obviously. And so that creates a much more fluid world. And one structural threat there is that the Charter of the United Nations, which in a way is the basis for when you use force, when we don't use force, and we have talked a lot about war and peace in the last 2 days, the Charter of the United Nations was designed for the kind of aggression that we saw when Hitler crossed the border of Poland. Today, and we discussed it in previous panels, we live in a world of ambiguity. And so that kind of clear-cut distinction is no more there. And there's a lot of confusion there on what is war, what is not war, when is self-defense possible, when it is not. And it's not just about Russia, it's about also, for instance, Western use of drones. Is it legitimate? Is it a new definition of self-defense when we bomb Syria, when we bomb camps in Syria? So there's no agreement on the status quo, and there's no agreement on the way to change the status quo. And so that makes for a much more dangerous world. Now, in that context, then you have, of course, a lot of new types of threats. A lot has been made of the Islamic State. Let me stress there that a number of terrorist attacks, they are made by homegrown terrorists. The number of people who joined the foreign fighters who joined the Islamic State, probably 30, 40 years ago, they would have joined the Badr Meinhof or the Red Brigades. Now, extreme Islamism is the only way they can see a way to fill, in a way, the vacuum, and pursuit of money is not the answer. And so you have disenfranchised youth in France, in Britain, in all our countries that are joining the Islamic State. And so the problem is not just to bomb the Islamic State in Syria, is how you address that. That is a very serious problem. We talk about nationalism throughout Europe, extreme right. That's another way to fill the vacuum. When you don't have Islamism, you have nationalism. This is, in a way, a response to the crisis of politics that we see. And so these internal threats, which are a reflection of the crisis of our own societies, are as important to address as the external threats. And if we don't have a sense of that, we're going to be weak, and we're not going to be able to address the external threat. Now, for the external threats, I think we have a strange relationship with military force today. I chaired the commission that reviewed French defense and national security. And so I'm convinced, as anybody, of the need to have a strong military. And I think the European record is on the whole dismal, that there should be a much more serious commitment to having effective military than there is today in Europe. At the same time, I see in Europe, and not just in Europe, in the United States too, big question on interventions, because after what I think is the less than great record of both Iraq and Libya, there are doubts on what military force can achieve. And in Europe, in the issues that concerns them in this room in particular, vis-à-vis Russia, because there is not that enormous concentration of force, nobody wants to think about the military. Or when people think about the military, they think about it in a somewhat casual way, as if war, a real big war, was not the ultimate catastrophe. And I think there the discourse must change. Being more serious about building the military, and at the same time being more serious about avoiding war. Because the combination of being casual about war and being casual about building defense is the worst of all worlds. And I see a lot of that in Europe today. A threat that has not been mentioned for Europe is that we talk about Syria, we talk about the Middle East. Let's talk about the Sahel. You have Sahel countries where the median age is 15 years old, 15.1. Half of the population is less than 15 years old. There is no way, even if they were all run by the most enlightened leaders, if they all had Lee Kuan Yew as their leaders, there is no way these countries are going to be able to absorb that youth bulge. So the question of migrations, not just refugees, and there we need to make the distinction, because we are throwing by the window fundamental distinctions that Europe was honored to contribute to inventing. The question of migrations is going to be upon us, not just for Syria and the Middle East. It's going to be upon us for the next 15, 20 years. And if we manage it, it's a great opportunity for Europe, an aging continent. If we don't manage it, it's a road to fragmentation and narrow nationalism and a catastrophic development for Europe. But let's not just think of the immediate crisis today. Let's think a bit beyond them. What's happening in Africa, which has the potential to really seriously disrupt what's happening in Europe if we don't pay attention.
We've learned that intermediate can become immediate very quickly. But you developed a whole panorama of threats and challenges now, but let's go from the inner to the external threats. And I would like to challenge you a bit on what you said, that basically our single idea in globalization is the pursuit of money. Now, isn't that an underestimation of the fundamentals that we have? In the sense of, yes, you know, the European Union, our democratic systems are being challenged, are more criticized probably than ever. But if I look around, the people on the Maidan were not out there for 2 or 3 months in the pursuit of money. They were out there because they hated the corruption in their own country, and they thought that the EU association agreement would give them a chance to finally, slowly, step by step, get rid of this. Even the Arab Spring, as much as it might have ended up very disappointingly, has begun with, we cannot go on with being harassed by the security service, with not having a chance of participation, with not being able to govern our own lives. And even the refugees, I mean, when it comes just to sort of protection of your life, they would have been doing sort of okay, or be at least protected in the camps in Lebanon, Jordan, and Turkey. But that's not what they want. They want to go to Europe. So isn't one of the challenges we face our own underestimation of what we can really offer?
Well, I do think that among the people, you're right, there are a number of people who are looking for something else. But among the governments of the world, I'd be much more skeptical. When you look at, for instance, I mean, when there was the fall of Mubarak, how everybody was saying, I was shocked, or we were so wrong, we can't, this was so bad to support the Mubarak regime. Now we have a different regime, which in terms of internal arrest actually goes much further than the Mubarak of the later years. And we are essentially fine with it. So that perception that democratic governments have double standards, that at the end of the day, when they feel threatened, they go for order, even if it's coercive order, that is something that is a great recruitment tool for all the jihadists of the world. You know, the Islamic State would not be what it is if in Iraq we had looked the other way when Shia militias were terrorizing Sunnis. In Syria, and I was involved in Syria with Kofi Annan in 2012, there's certainly a sense among many of the opponents of Assad, that there was a lot of rhetoric against Assad, but not much action. And I think it would have been actually much wiser to have less rhetoric and a little more action.
Well, less rhetoric is always wise, but we're always faced and challenged by the accusation of double standards when it comes to foreign policy, because actually, as we all know, in foreign policy, there's not good or bad or wonderful options and bad options. Usually it's bad options and worse options. So it's easy to get into the realm of double standards. But I'm also talking about our discourses at home, basically also with many of the populists. And I'm really amazed why we do not sort of get back the discourse from them and saying, well, after all, our system is not so bad, because it includes one thing that most other systems know, none other system has, and that's the ability to self-correct.
Yes, though, well, I don't want to...
Well, Bill, please, you're invited to say something on that.
No, I mean, I would phrase myself like Jean-Marie say, the pursuit of money. I would say the globalization has been, you could say the globalization is the pursuit of money. Mm-hmm. Because it is two things. It is a race in the borders and the barriers. And it is another thing that goes to the internal order of society, is the rule of law. Because if you don't have rules internally and externally that are reliable, globalization doesn't work. So that globalization is, as a matter of fact, is not only something that gives us more money, less people in poverty, it also gives us order. An order externally by the rules of the trade game, or whatever, and it gives us a better order internally if it works. Mm-hmm. So the pursuit of money, yes, I can agree with it. I would phrase it somewhat differently. And I would put a somewhat more positive spin on it, as you can hear.
I put it a bit provocatively,
yes,
but...
yes, that's good.
Which is totally okay, Prime Minister.
But at the same time, I think order, yes, but then, and it's very visible in the Arab Spring and in the social circumstances of the Arab Spring. It's often a very uneven new order. Because, of course, the development, which is a very good thing, benefits a certain sliver of the population first, and so it exacerbates a sense of injustice in a number of countries, and so that certainly was a big factor in generating in the birth of the Arab Spring.
We do want to go back to keeping our own house in
yes,
order.
I agree with that. Although, of course, one of the fundamental issues, if you go to the Arab world, or the two fundamental issues. One is the economic one. I mean, this is a region of 400 million people that is heading for 600 million people, and that can't produce economic growth. Accordingly, unemployment is increasing and despair among people. The second issue there is legitimacy. There are very few regimes that has basic legitimacy in the Arab world today. The Islamic State, whatever we think of it, mostly negatively I would say, produces a narrative of legitimacy that stretches back 1,500 years in history. While the other state structures that are there can't have the same claim on legitimacy. I think we underestimate that part of the story.
Prime Minister,
what I wanted to say is that I think it was stressed also by other colleagues, is that yes, we are facing many challenges, more than ever before probably, external and internal, but our ability to deal with the external ones will depend on the success of addressing the internal challenges. To put our house in order is absolutely the key, because the best way Europe can be a global player and global leader is to lead by example, this famous soft power. Well, when we are enabled to demonstrate it within the European Union, then it's difficult to expect that we will be respected as a global player. And for this, we also need to stop being naive. Naive means believing that if you get rid of a dictator, he will be replaced by a democrat. We have seen several examples for that. We shall stop being naive, believing that everybody wants to be us, and therefore we have a right to go around and teach people.
That's the conversions era, that we all converge somehow. Mm-hmm.
Well, let's welcome all those who want to look like us, but let's not assume that everybody, that we are the shining role model. Let's try to be, but again, it depends on our ability to show this leadership by addressing our internal problems. That's extremely important. And respect the rules, our own rules, also with communication with our partners. No double standards, if possible. And support the principles, the ideas, values, and not the players. And every time we forget about this basic formula, we fail as a global actor in external relations.
That's concerns sort of the European software, to frame it that way. But I would like to get it back to the European hardware, and that is the structures of the European Union. When I've listened to Carl Bildt, and he was saying, well, I'm afraid of a fracturing in the European Union, you know, the one thing that occurs to me is, why don't we strengthen the Commission? Why don't we have more of an executive power in Europe? Why don't we have a much stronger high representative who doesn't have to take, you know, a normal flight, but yeah, why don't we strengthen the European Action Service? And why don't we work on a democratic legitimacy, which of course comes along with it? So far, we have a very intergovernmental approach. So shouldn't we be working on a more, you know, European government approach, which of course, and I know that Julian Lindley-French is in here, and he will probably ask a question about the Brexit, but I'll ask it first, Julian, which of course leads to the question, is this a European Union that Great Britain wants to be part of, and how can we keep it part of? So first question, strengthening of the European Union and the European Commission, should we not sort of support them and basically rather than hiding behind them when something not so good is happening? And how can we do this? First question to you, Carl Bildt.
Well, I think it will happen the one way or the other, although I think it's going to happen primarily through an intergovernmental approach. If you look at the refugee crisis now, or the migration crisis, or whatever we call it, I think it will call for measures that you go beyond what is in the existing treaties. And if you go beyond the existing treaties, by definition, you need to have an agreement between the different governments. And you can argue that a lot of the crises that we've been dealing with go outside what we've designed the treaties for, and that means that it's governments' meetings in Brussels that does it. Over time, perhaps, that leads to treaty changes that produces these things.
The one thing we all fear, opening up the treaties once again.
Opening up the treaties is not necessarily... I do think that we are going to see a European integration process driven by the practical necessities rather than the ideological visions. Mm-hmm. The problem with treaty changes has been that they have often been portrayed in cloudy, stratospheric, ideological terms that people have nowadays. Immediately after the Second World War, it was different. Nowadays, the young generation has difficulty sort of associating with. But a Europe that is driven by the practical necessity of small nations working together in an increasingly messy world, I think that will work.
Thank you. Prime Minister, yeah.
The treaty changes are inevitable. The question is when they will come. There is clearly no appetite.
That, please. Treaty change is inevitable?
Not now. There is no appetite. It's not politically feasible to reopen the treaties now. But we have already declared that we are going to deepen the EMU, and for this we will have to reopen the treaties. But as I said, we shall not speed up this. But speaking about the European architecture, in the meantime, we can and shall go further as fast and as far as we have the unity of the 28 member states. That's the key principle. What is also important is to keep the balance between the three key institutions: European Parliament, European Council, European Commission. There should be as little institutional fight as possible. I was part of the Brussels bubble myself, so I know what I'm talking about. And second, not try to subordinate one to the other, because European structures are different from national structures. The role of European Parliament is different from the role of national parliaments. Let's not forget the member states. It's extremely, for me, the role of the Council should not be marginalized. And third, what I personally see as one of the most powerful things about the European project is our ability to agree, to compromise, to arrive at a consensus. And this is, yeah, some might be joking about the length of our processes, but the most important is that in the end, everybody can live with the product, with the agreement, with the document, with the process. And we must not abandon this. So we really have to work hard to make sure that everybody is in consensus with the decision.
Well, consensus is the right keyword then to sort of lead exactly to what Carl Bildt has been framing as one of the major challenges to the European Union, and that is a Brexit. And it seems to me that it could be a Brexit by accident and political clumsiness as well as by will. But how do you convince the Brits that they should stay in the European Union? What kind of European Union do they offer? And from all the conversations I have, one of the most important one is, how can it be democratically legitimized so it basically resembles the kind of democratic legitimation we have in Great Britain?
Well, I live a big part of my life outside Europe, and I would encourage every British citizen to travel outside Europe, because he or she would immediately see that, particularly in the United States, Europe is seen as the possible interlocutor, that the United Kingdom, France, even Germany separately are taken much less seriously. So if the United Kingdom wants to have an influence in the world, it will have it only if it is in the European Union. Out of the European Union, that influence will be very severely diminished. When you live outside Europe, it's a kind of a self-evident truth. I think in Europe, where we are consumed in our differences and little disputes, we don't see it. But the world is moving on. And if the Europeans are not capable of integrating more, they will just be the spectators of their own decline. They will not be actors in tomorrow's world. That's something so obvious when you go around the world, and something that seems not so obvious when you are in Europe. And that's a sad story of Europe today, I think.
But Jean-Marie, is not also a bit of the mental problem we have, which I find very often in conversations with younger Europeans? We have a rhetoric of necessity. If we don't build up the European Union, the world outside is troublesome, we have to stick together. It's always a rhetoric of necessity. It's almost never a rhetoric. You gain quite a bit from it. It's great to be in the European Union. It has advantages for you. Not only don't open the door, the weather out there is stormy, even if you don't like the home, but it's rather, we have a wonderful home, and yes, the weather is stormy out there.
Yes, no, the Europe is a nice, beautiful garden. If it wants to remain a nice, beautiful garden, it has to have the capacity to make sure that the rest of the world is not a jungle. And for that, it needs some real power. And the historical experience, I think, since the European Union, the European Commission before it was started, the common market, was that Europe works when it is integrated, and it's a very painful process when it is not. Now, of course, when it comes to foreign affairs, when it comes to security, which deal with the risk of losing one's life, which deals with identities, where geography matters, when you are more concerned, obviously, here with Russia and Spain probably is more concerned with what's going on the other side of the Mediterranean, that's inevitable. So in those matters, of course, the process of integration is much harder. But I think there should be clarity that without integration, Europe will be inefficient. And when you look at opinion polls, actually, it's quite striking that at the level of public opinion, matters like defense and foreign affairs are seen by lay people as obvious areas for more integration. But they're not seen the same way by national diplomats who see that they would commit harakiri if they did that.
Yeah.
No, to follow on that, if you look at the opinion polls for the confidence in the European Union, you see that confidence in the European Union has been improving during the last year and a half. Why is that? Because there is a perception, rightly or wrongly, that Europe was able to deal with the euro crisis. You can discuss whether they did or did not, but the perception is. And accordingly, people feel that Europe was able to deliver. And I think, going back to your basic question, keeping the Brits in, we need to do somewhat more, to take Jean-Marie's word. We need to be able to demonstrate a better ability at gardening. Not just keeping the garden as it is, but tending to the garden. And I would say that two things would demonstrate that we have that ability. The TTIP. If they can do a major trade agreement across the Pacific, but we can't do it across the Atlantic, then we demonstrate that we are incapable.
I thought that your intervention was a plaidoyer for TTIP.
Yeah, but there's another thing as well, and that's the single market, primarily the digital single market. if we can't demonstrate that we can create a digital single market where the Chinese have one and the Americans have one, we also demonstrate that we are a mess. So those two key issues of gardening, I think, is critical also to demonstrate to the Brits that this European project is moving forward and is of increasing relevance in the world.
Thank you. Would you like to?
Yes, I'm glad that Carol just said that the confidence in the European Union is increasing, because that's what we need. We need to be more self-confident, and we have many reasons to be. The European Union is still the most successful integration project, at least on this planet, and no other group of countries have achieved better results in economic prosperity, in social protection and social standards, in the respect for human rights. But you don't say this, you don't hear this in the European Union. You don't win elections being pro-EU nowadays. We generate negative messages about ourselves, all doomsday scenarios which are made in the European Union. So how can we expect that we will be admired by our outside partners when we are not respecting ourselves? So we need to be balanced in this regard. But here, of course, I also agree that we need to cultivate the project. We need to take care of the garden to make sure that we stay as a model as much as possible.
Before we move on to the external threats, I'd really like to take this to the auditory and ask, are there any more questions on, of course, I knew it, Julian, stand up, ask your question, on Brexit, on internal threats, on possible European resilience, on opening of the treaties. Just fire away with your questions. Yeah.
Thank you, Soka. I love listening to learned foreigners lecturing me about my country.
This is so British to say that.
Well, I mean, come on, chaps. There are serious questions about whether Britain would decline outside the EU. A lot of analysis has Britain as the biggest economy in Europe by 2030. You can hardly say that the EU is a growth-rich centre of activity. So I don't want Britain to leave the EU. But I think if you continue to tell us that if we leave the EU, we'll simply be finished, you'll find it actually encourages some of our more extreme elements to say, well, okay, then, good luck. There is a serious set of questions here. At the centre of the Brexit debate is not the current relationship between Britain and the EU. It's the relationship between Britain and the Eurozone, the real EU. And it's not even about what the relationship is today. It's the contradiction in all the comments I've heard so far is we're going to have more integration, but by definition, Britain won't be part of that integration. Therefore, the relationship will change. So you'll have these common gardeners, to use your metaphors, with the Brits acting as a kind of outside gardener. And those common gardeners are going to be doing more things commonly together. So the real question here is what is going to be a just and legitimate fair costing relationship between the UK, a major economy, a top 5 economy of the world, a top 5 military actor, and this future much more integrated core Europe. If we can find a legitimate set of relationships there, I'm sure we can have a new political settlement. But to be blunt, it's precisely this kind of analysis which will lead us to drift towards a Brexit, which I simply don't want. And one final point. Yeah, sure, you can find those people who say that Britain outside the EU is finished. But one of the reasons we do that is we exaggerate the growth of China, we exaggerate the growth of India and others. We don't examine their immense internal contradictions. There's no absolute certainty that the Europeans are doomed to decline and these countries are doomed to rise because of their own internal contradictions. So to be absolutely blunt, you're going to have to make a far better case than that to me to convince me that I really should vote to stay inside the coming EU in which you'll be integrated and we won't be. So
who of you wants to convince this British citizen to say, no, this of course is a wonderful moment to reiterate, this is live streamed and please, whoever watches this, send in your questions by Twitter as well, we'll take them up. Yeah.
No, I mean, just on what I think was your fundamental point, the relationship with the Eurozone and the UK and the others. I think here David Cameron has got a point, and I think he's got to drive a bargain that is going to be in the interest of everyone. Because it's going to be the situation for the foreseeable future, for better or worse, that not all of the countries are members of the Euro. Accordingly, we need some sort of bridge that is more reliable between the Eurozone, monetary cooperation, and the single market. And I would argue that I'm a supporter of the euro, but apart from that, the single market is even more important, particularly if you look at the digital and other components, and that as a global economic actor. And that bridge makes it possible not only for the UK but for the others to go on and develop the single market. And it is a fact, if you look at global trading ahead, that global trading will be driven by the big deals between the big actors. And you have to make up your mind which big actor you are part of. And if you're outside the big European actor, I'm not quite certain where you are. Norway, Switzerland, Liechtenstein, you can have an alliance with Iceland in the mid-Atlantic. Sorry?
This whole Norway, Switzerland, Liechtenstein thing is almost insulting.
No.
Wait a second.
Well, no. Norway is a very nice place.
We're not trying to make Great Britain smaller than it is, but let him finish his argument.
Norway.
I'm becoming stern.
That's exactly what we aimed at this session. Thank you. Prime Minister.
I don't want to speculate about the image of the UK being outside of the European Union. I really believe that it's better for UK and for Union to be as we are. One point to reinforce what Carol already alluded to is, even if UK was theoretically, hypothetically outside of the Union, there will be very strong relations with the Union, because obviously the trade and economic partnerships, but what would be missing is your possibility to influence European policies. So you will be affected by them, but you will not have the say in their formulations. So that's for me a good enough reason. And second, I accept without prejudice the notion of UK in better reformed European Union. So why don't we rather focus on the ongoing process to see how to make EU less bureaucratic, more efficient, more open, more free, so that we will all benefit from it.
Thank you. Let's move on to the external threats. I would very much like to go to defense and foreign affairs, and of course we'll open it in a few seconds. Yesterday, or was it this morning, we've been discussing again about the 2% issue. But then I'm wondering, whenever it comes up, raising our defense budgets to 2% of our GDP, for Europe, wouldn't it be much smarter to spend our money smarter with, a smart defense, with a common defense, rather than sort of raising national budgets to buy, excuse me for putting it so bluntly, to buy stuff? While at the same time, if we really want to accompany our soft power with some real hard power, which we definitely need, where are we on a common security and defense policy? And shouldn't we be doing much more and laying structures that still are not there?
Well,
please go ahead.
Of course, there is enormous waste today in the way various defense budgets are juxtaposed, and each country procurement has its own procurement rules, and there's not much enough use of the European Defence Agency and the few structures that have been created that could help make for more rational procurement. So there's a lot that can be done there, but let's not underestimate the difficulties of integrating that part of the effort. I think it would be very useful, but it will be as painful as increasing the percentage in the defense budget, to be honest. And at the end of the day, money is needed, because I think when you spend a very small amount of money, there are limits to what you can do. So even if you put it together, it will work only if you have integration in the management of defense, enormous political problems, and if you have integration in foreign policy, which raises even greater issues. I'm personally in favor of both, but I don't think it will happen overnight. And so in the meantime, if there is not a greater effort, if there are no greater national efforts, I don't think that just better cooperation will work, because it will take a long time to integrate defense ministries, and it will take a very long time to integrate foreign policy. I regret it, but I think that's a political reality.
Yes, please.
No, and I agree with Jean-Marie, we need both. There's no question that we need increased spending, because some of the systems that we need are extremely expensive. If I look at it from the Swedish perspective, we need sort of slightly larger number of fighter aircraft. We are fairly big in European terms already, but we need more. They are not cheap. We need to augment our submarine force. They are not cheap, to put it very mildly. There's no way around. But I would say that critical is that we start to plan and operate together somewhat more than we've been doing. I mean, the amount of exercises, we see the Russians doing the one big exercise after the other at the moment, and getting these forces to think together and plan together and train together for somewhat more major contingencies. That has been severely lacking, and that means that our sort of intellectual ability to operate these forces have been degraded during the last... We've been doing other useful things. We're doing peacekeeping operations. I wouldn't degrade those at all. They've been immensely and are still going to be demanding and important. But we need to go back to an ability to operate the forces together again.
Mr. Ledger, you want to also contribute here?
Yeah, the truth is that when we speak about the hard security, we are not in a good shape. What needs to be done? First, to strengthen the transatlantic bond. Second, be serious about our defense expenses. We cannot expect the US to do it for us forever. We have to implement what was agreed in Wales. We are progressing not very well, not very fast, but okay, there is a clear pressure to do so. Third, EU-NATO institutional relationship. It's a big problem. We tolerate for too long that because of bilateral issues, we are not using the full potential of EU and NATO. We are wasting money and we are risking our lives because of bilateral issues. And point number 4, complementarity. Complementarity within the European Union and between the EU and NATO.
Just to check how serious we are on this, 2 very quick questions. Carl Bildt, is Sweden joining NATO anytime soon?
The Swedish government is saying that they are distinctly against it, so they will not do it. Okay,
that's a clear answer. The second question to all of you.
No, because we are a democracy, so we change governments now and then. But I mean, so that's a separate issue.
Glad to hear that. The second question is just to shortly touch it, because I really want to open this to your question, is when it comes to Ukraine and Russia. How serious are we on sanctions? I mean, we've agreed over the last almost 2 years that on the military sector we don't stand much of a chance, but we should win this, at least on the economic sector. And that means, and also to show that our European order has been very much seriously undermined. Just give me an outlook. Are we keeping up the sanctions?
Yes. I think we are serious on sanctions. I think we are more serious than we expected ourselves, and certainly more serious than the other side expected. And that's why there is no further military advancement, because we made it quite clear that if there is, there will be additional sanctions. Second, on the future of sanctions, we are very clear. We link them to the implementation of the Minsk package, so we know what needs to be done before we can consider lifting the sanctions. And third, and here I would quote Frank-Walter Steinmeier, who says that sometimes our sanctions look like one-way street. So we are quick to get in, and then we are very cumbersome to get out, and to find a way how to do it, and when is the right time. So the time is not now, but it's also important that we know when the time comes and how we are going to deal with it.
Well, didn't we tack it to Minsk? When the Minsk agreement is fulfilled, then we can think about relieving the sanctions?
Yes, but the Crimea is not part of the Minsk package. So Minsk, let's hope, will be implemented sooner or later. Crimea later rather than sooner will return to Ukraine. So that's one dilemma we'll have to deal with, for example.
Thank you. Would you like to also say, I mean, do you share this assessment that we'll be strong on the sanctions and we'll keep strong on the sanctions?
I do agree. You just add that, of course, there is not only the sort of the big sanctions package that is now linked to Minsk, there's also Crimea sanctions that are different. But then I would add that the most important thing, after all, that we can do is to help, support, strengthen the stability of Ukraine. Because if Ukraine were to go wrong, no sanctions in the world will prevent Russia from using the disorder that is going to be there.
Yeah, I think it's going to be a long game. The Minsk agreement is just a part of the issue, and there, frankly, and of course it's easy to say when you're not in government, but I think the level of support, of economic support and financial support to Ukraine is not quite what it should be, because at the moment the Ukrainian government has started putting in place some reforms, and I personally think that it should go much further, but there is a beginning of that. The reforms, if they are pursued, are painful for the population. We see populist politicians beginning to exploit that, and for the government to stay the course, it would be easier with greater international support than it presently gets. So I think there is a responsibility, a strategic responsibility, not just for the European Union, because it's a package which involves the United States, the IMF. There's a responsibility, in my view, to do more than what is presently done, because in the long term, what will ensure the consolidation of a democratic Ukraine is a Ukraine that has eradicated corruption, that is a well-functioning democracy and economy. And in the meantime, Eastern Ukraine is probably going to remain a messy place for a while. And so there probably will not be full implementation, by the way, of the Minsk agreement before long.
I don't think that the money is the key question here. Of course, there could always be more money, but the key word here is the reforms. And it's about how the money is spent, how the system is changed. 2 years ago, Ukrainians demanded better functioning state, less corruption, independent judiciary, limited role of oligarchs. How much of this has changed for better in these 2 years with our involvement? So I see lots of effort on the side of Ukrainian institutions. I don't see enough coordination. As a matter of fact, I see lots of mess as a result of this miscoordination. And here, I believe European Union should step in, and I am campaigning for that unsuccessfully. I really believe that if there are, among the things EU is very good at, is to help countries reform. That's what we do in the Balkans, that's what we do in other parts of the world, and I have problems to understand why we are reluctant to do so, to provide the blueprint for reforms for Ukraine, to help guide them through the process of reform. So it's not, one law here and one law there, and one step ahead and two steps backwards, as we sometimes see, but someone who has the credibility, also vis-à-vis Ukrainian people, and to help them to steer them through this difficult process. And I think this is the key issue here. This is the key issue for the future of Ukraine. And I'm absolutely certain that we, the European Union, could and should do more.
And it goes back, if I might add just this, to some of the things we've been talking about on the previous panel, namely Russian propaganda, or because clearly there's an attempt to eternally not only black paint Ukraine as a fascist state, but also as a basket case that's never going to make these reforms. But I really would like to open now to the auditory. I have a question here, and then we go here, and then we take a third one here. And I was very impressed by the non-digital way questions were handed in here, because my Twitter account does not work. Thank you, digital work. So I get these printouts, obviously, by some hand handing it in here. So in the meantime, yes, please go ahead, and then we'll have you, and then we'll go back here. And please introduce yourself, be short, and ask a question to some of the panelists.
Yes, I will. Klaus Wittmann, Aspen Institute, Germany. I would like to bring up Turkey, that was not mentioned once, but whose cooperation we will need in the refugee crisis. And I think before Erdogan writes out his price tag, we should, in the EU, should creatively think of offers to make in our own right What most people don't know or don't remember is that in the WEU, Turkey was an associate member. And when those functions were taken in the EU, they lost all that. And I have sat through hour-long meetings in NATO headquarters where Turkey clamored to get back its WEU acquis. Now, I could imagine a very attractive offer without any prejudice to the accession talks, invite Turkey to fully participate in the ESDP, in the European Defence Agency. Of course, one would have to convince Greece and Cyprus that that is a good idea, and I would be very interested in reactions to this idea.
Yes. Carl, would you like to answer this quickly?
Yeah, I can answer that question, because I think one of the positive things that might happen, I mean, we are talking about gloomy pictures here of things ahead. There's one bright spot. We might, as a matter of fact, after the breakdown of Cyprus, which happened in 1963, when UN forces were deployed in the middle of what is today a capital city of the EU, we might get a Cyprus agreement. If we get a Cyprus agreement, say by next spring, then the blockage that is there between the EU and NATO will disappear, including making it possible for inviting Turkey to the European Defence Agency. Not that I think the Turks will be overly impressed by that particular step, has to be said. It's not the most potent agency mankind has ever heard of, but it's a step. But I think clearly we need to look at, we will have the possibility in that case, to look at the Turkey entire accession process in new light. We need them for quite a number of things, not only as the border guard of Europe. I take some slight offense to what is there in the debate at the moment, because we say that since the Greeks can't manage the border, we want the Turks to manage the border. That's slightly odd, and I would like to see the Turkish issue handled somewhat more broadly.
Prime Minister, you would like to add something?
Very briefly, Turkey is a key, absolutely. We don't have to speculate about the offer, because they already let us know what their expectations are. And of course, it's to deblock the accession process, to deliver visa liberalization, to recognize their status by organizing regular meetings, consultation summits, inviting them to our deliberations, and obviously financial assistance. So we know what's at the table. What we don't know is how are we going to react to it, whether we are in recognition of the huge challenge we are facing together, and we need Turkey on our side, we are going to be more flexible, or not.
Yeah, thank you. Perhaps we could take two or more, please. Yeah, go ahead. I'll have you on the list, yeah.
Yes. Future of European Order. Hamid Lajavardi, American Baltic Investments. Over the last 7 years, Europe has gone through a number of crises. It may go, and is going through one now, may go through another one or two in the future. Looking 5 to 10 years ahead, what values and aspirations of Europe will be strengthened, and which ones will be degraded, specifically?
Well, we'll ask this crystal ball question in a minute. There's one question back here, yeah, and then I take a second round. Yeah. Can you hand back the mic? Thanks. Yes.
Thank you. I'm Gaha Gogolashvili from Georgian Foundation for Strategic and International Studies. As Georgian, this question is very important for me. I know that we can agree that European Union is trying to deepen, or there is policy of deepening of the relations, deepening of increasing number of common policies, etc. But somehow this contradicts to the policy of enlargement. I see that it's becoming more and more difficult for countries, potential candidate countries, to join European Union, to integrate with European Union, because of increased number of common policies, because of lots of things to be taken into account, the deepening, the acquis, etc., etc. So it's becoming, but both policies are very important for European Union, deepening and enlargement as well. I just would like to ask you what you think about the future of Europe. So what will be more important in the foreseeable future? Enlargement policy or deepening? And here I can also remind the case of United Kingdom. I think that there is some hesitation of United Kingdom with the deepening, and probably United Kingdom would agree more on enlargement, that Europe goes more towards enlargement than towards deepening of policies, in policies. So this is one, and second, if I may, important also.
A quick one, because I have a whole list.
Important question about the defense capability, possibility of associated states. I say just associated, it's not correct term, but newly associated states like Georgia, Moldova, and Ukraine, who are not by any agreement linked with European Union in terms of defense policies, their defense policies. I mean that European Union has no any binding obligation to defend somehow these countries before aggression. For example, like clause in the agreement, in the Lisbon Agreement, solidarity clause, which is very important tool that European countries can meet, not to defend directly, but to support by any means the partner country or EU member states in case of aggression against them. So would it be possible in the future that Europe considers something like this, a soft obligation towards these associated countries in the future, in case of aggression against them, to have obligation, legal obligation, to provide support, for example, military support or financial or technical support, not exactly to defend like Article 5 of NATO. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me rephrase this question a bit. Is building bridges enough when we deepen the European Union and enlarge at the same time? And I would like to ask a question to you.
Well, I think this question was relevant 10, 11 years ago when Europe was about to decide which way to follow, either to go for deepening or for enlargement, and the decision was made to go after both, which I appreciate because we were very much depending on the enlargement at that time. Now, what we need is to consolidate, to stabilize European Union, which does not mean we are abandoning the enlargement. The process is going by itself, the rules are there, but we know that it's going to take time even for the best prepared countries to knock on our door and tell us we are ready, and we have to use this time really to stabilize the internal processes and mechanisms.
Carl Bildt, would you like to take up the question on what values will we see in 10 years? I have to say I have a bit of difficulties to sort of really look into the crystal ball and say, well, this is going to happen in 10 years when we live in a time where there's so many unexpected events shaking us up. But still, yeah.
I haven't a clue.
That's a short answer.
No, but it's clearly that we are facing a world where the risk of disorder is greater than we had hoped for and thought. We faced a Russia that is more unpredictable. We failed to predict Crimea and Donbass. We failed to predict Syria. We can be quite certain that there are other things that we will fail to predict. Accordingly, we need to build a European cooperation, a European Union that is more resistant, more able, more flexible in its ability to respond to uncertainty and disorder. That is going to be the name of the game if we look ahead.
I would combine the two questions in a way, because we look at commitment of treaties, Article 5 of NATO, we look at the EU. When you look at opinion polls on the implementation of Article 5, actually the results are quite worrying. You see that except for the USA and Canada, the commitment to go to war if another country of NATO is attacked is rather weak. And that raises a key point, is that you have treaties and then you have the perception of solidarity, or you don't have it. And in matters of war and solidarity, that is essential. If you don't have that, the treaty is an empty shell. And so that comes to the question of values. If the Europeans are not capable of agreeing on a few values that they think they can defend together, I don't think that any commitment, association, or whatever with members or non-members will do the trick. So, in a way, your question on where Europe will be on values, and I don't have a crystal ball to say exactly which values will be the dominant values in 10 years or 15 years from now. But if Europe hasn't rallied around a few fundamental values, I think any notion of solidarity, whether it's defense of our economy, will be an empty slogan.
Thanks. I have a few Twitter questions and one suggestion, because there are a few Twitter questions who go to people in the auditory or even me. I would suggest the following. I'm not going to answer any questions. I'm the moderator here. But if you want to engage with people in the auditory, find them on Twitter, engage with them on the Twitter account, because we cannot do it on a panel. But I have two questions for Carl Bildt. By Andrei Matisak, I hope I pronounced the name right. If Brexit is really such a problem, should we give Cameron everything, or some red line, or are some red lines needed? Well, red lines is always a tricky thing. Yeah. And then there's a second one. You said that further EU integration will be based on practical necessity. So the question is, will we experience that first in foreign or in the internal or domestic domain?
Sorry, what was
we do the Brexit first. Red lines or give Cameron everything?
Well, of course, they're red lines, but I think we've learned that you shouldn't sort of talk too much about red lines, because they turn into pink zones fairly fast. So careful with that. What he has been outlining so far, and I understand there will be a letter delivered in the next few days,
yes,
is, as a matter of fact, not impossible and not unreasonable. Were he to demand something that goes well beyond that, yeah, then I think it would be a different issue. But what the Brits have been outlining so far is not unreasonable and not impossible. That doesn't say that it's going to be easy, but it should be feasible and possible. Then, of course, the big issue is going to be, is this going to be enough for him to win a referendum? That's going to be the big thing.
Thanks. And the second question was, if further EU integration will be based on practical necessity, will we experience that first in the foreign or internal domain?
I think we'll do it in both. I mean, clearly we do it in the foreign domain. I mean, when we see all of these threats that are coming, be that refugee migration, be that Russia, be that the meltdown, wider meltdown of the Middle East, that should force us together in foreign affairs. Have we seen enough of that? No. I think we've seen during the last year and a half, or 2 years perhaps, a tendency towards renationalization of foreign policy, but I hope that one will see the limits of that and go back to, call it the Maastricht track or something like that. But also we see it on the domestic side. If you call the digital market domestic, I don't know. But clearly we need to do far more to utilize all of the potential that is there in the what the Germans call the fourth industrial revolution, the hyper-connected world, the digital world.
Industry 4, yeah. I guess a digital market by definition cannot be national in a way. It seems to be a contradiction in itself.
Mean, listen to part of the German debate and they seem to be under that misapprehension.
Oh, well, part of the German debate, just for pragmatic reasons. We have a question here, then we have the mic go here, and then we have the gentleman over there. So can we have, where are the mics? We have all the assistants come run down the aisles because we have to go all the way through the first row. Thanks, ladies, for coming here. Yeah.
Just a quick question, Vasyl Marcinchenko, Ukraine Crisis Media Center. The question to Jean-Marie. I'm very curious to hear what you do in Ukraine. Please brief us about that, International Crisis Group. And I was just wondering, we have over 1 million internally displaced people in Ukraine. And if 10% of those people swarmed into the EU today or tomorrow, using the David Cameron's lingo, and what should be the reaction of the EU? And isn't it a major threat, which is still possible if the war escalates?
Thank you. Let me pass the mic on perhaps to the rows behind you, thanks, because Sergei Utkin here wants to ask a question. And then just to get for you, I have you all on the list, to be prepared. Yeah, can you? Exactly. So.
Sir Gutkin, Russian Academy of Sciences. A question to Carl Bildt and Jean-Marie Guéhenno. You know perfectly well this Franco-British deal on defense cooperation, a very advanced agreement which was done basically outside the framework of the EU. And France and Britain basically see themselves as the only countries that matter in defense matters in Europe. So do you think this is the way forward, so that other countries in Europe also should have this kind of bilateral deals, or is it a problem for building a really common security and defense policy in Europe?
Thank you very much. Yes, and we take a third one and then we go back to the panel.
Masaishi, once again, Ambassador of Japan to NATO. Because this is the last session and we have three big minds in front of us, I'm tempted to ask you this. I'd like to hear a little bit more from you about your view about future global order and the role Europe would play. And you know, we started this conference with your discussion about geoeconomics, while we didn't talk too much about China, which is a little bit of a surprise to me. And you know, in relation to Ukraine, we are part of the sanction regime, simply because we believe this is a global issue that touches a fundamental value, that is, you're not supposed to change the status quo unilaterally by force. Yet, we are hearing not much from Brussels about what's going on in South China Sea, although this is relating to the rule of law. So my belief is I think Europe is one of the few pillars in the world which are ready and also able to work for the global stability. And I'm sure, and I believe and I hope that Europe stay engaged globally because you are able to do it and you are strong enough and I think you are curious enough to do so.
Of course, we love to hear this kind of optimism. Wonderful. Thank you very much for that. Jean-Marie, I'll ask you the first two questions. Ukraine, what do we do? Is there a next threat coming upon us? What do we do with internally displaced people in Ukraine if they sort of make themselves on their way to the EU territories? And the second thing, because it also went to you and then goes on to Carl, is the French-British defense cooperation, this kind of building defense islands, the right way to a pooling and sharing or common European defense policy?
Well, on Ukraine, I know your question was also what Crisis Group does in Ukraine. Yeah, we have an analyst based in Kiev who has gone regularly to Donetsk and who is and actually it's an interesting assessment to see how the people in the east now feel let down in a way by Moscow as the Russian policy evolves there. And so I think our contribution there is to provide field-based analysis on what happens at the very local level. There are lots of people commenting on the broader picture. I think what Crisis Group can bring to the discussion is an understanding of the local dynamics, and we're going to continue to do that in the coming year. Now, if 1 million people came into Europe, yes, well, I think it's part of the broader refugee crisis. I don't see how such a situation can be dealt with without an integrated policy to spread the burden that would represent for European countries. I think it would be a further push to have more integrated policies, because no country on its own would be able to deal with such a human catastrophe.
Jean-Marie, can you hold a second thought a bit, because Carl Bildt has to leave a bit earlier to catch a flight. Perhaps you want to just take this one question on French-British defense cooperation. Is this a way forward?
Well, I mean, the French-British is, there were many aspects to it, but one that should not be forgotten is the nuclear one. They are the only nuclear powers. Whether it is wise for them to spend these enormous amounts of money on that, that's more debatable. Look at the Trident debates. And as a matter of fact, if you look at defense spending in Europe, the country that is spending the most on non-nuclear forces is neither France nor Britain, it's Germany. That being said, I think it's good what they do in terms of defense cooperation. We do quite a lot in the Nordic context, trying to do more, integrate forces more here and plan things together. And I don't see a contradiction between what you do between individual nations. I see that as contributions to the overall picture. Let me just finally say on the Ukraine humanitarian, awareness of that I think is very important, and we should not repeat the mistake that we've done to a certain extent with Syria, that we were not funding the humanitarian efforts in the region enough. We should help the Ukrainian government to carry the burden of these people. They don't want to go to Poland or Sweden, they want to remain in Ukraine. Let's help Kiev to carry the financial burden of doing that.
Thank you very, very much.
On the French-British Saint-Malo framework, I think one has to be very pragmatic. And so when two countries which have two significant defense industries, a lot of defense programs can combine their efforts a bit, that's a good thing. It has, and there is of course the nuclear dimension. The view of France is that having nuclear powers in Europe adds to the strategic stability because it complicates any calculation and use of nuclear weapons by Russia in the particular case. And so it's a good thing for Europe that such nuclear capabilities exist. They are indeed very costly. I think these bilateral agreements should not be a substitute for a more integrated framework. They can feed into it. There are examples of in the industrial domain where there have been good cooperation on missiles. This is one area where European countries have been able to cooperate well. There are areas where the cooperation could be much better than it is. I think the failed integration of British aerospace, and that's something that maybe someday should be revisited. But let's be pragmatic there. Let's not think that there is one framework to make progress.
Thank you very much. Prime Minister Ledger, can I ask you, or pass the question on the global order? I mean, we've not seen much of a, let's call it, common European pivot to Asia here. We've seen a lot of mercantilist activity in this part of the world. But can you see Europe as a global player also interested in, crises, possible, not so very far-fetched crisis in the South China Sea? Do we have a role to play there?
Actually, I have come here yesterday directly from Luxembourg, where together with the Foreign Minister Rinkevich, we attended the Eurasia ministerial meeting, and the issue of the South China Sea was very frequently mentioned there, and it's also referred to in the concluding document that we adopted, so I cannot agree that EU is silent on this issue. Now, European Union is very much present also in Asia, but more economically than politically. So that's one of the things I believe we shall look at, how to match our political influence to our economic power. And that's also one of the things that we need to fix at home. European Union, as I see it, outside of the European continent, is a positive global player, supporting noble goals such as climate change, such as fight against poverty, such as humanitarian assistance, traditionally number one provider of development assistance, humanitarian assistance to countries. I don't think it's appreciated enough. I don't think it's well known enough to our own citizens. And I also believe that we have to do a better job in linking our political dialogue with countries to our economic programs and humanitarian programs in these countries.
Jean-Marie, would you like to add something on that?
Well, I think on the South China Sea, I mean, at the moment, the Europeans don't have military capability that would allow them to play a significant role. One has to be realistic. At the same time, I think there has to be engagement with China because Europe is a major trading power, so freedom of the seas is fundamental for European interests. And I think China needs also to be engaged on a multitude of fronts. Africa is a major interest, security interest for Europe, and potentially an economic one if Africa becomes one of the engines of growth in the coming years. China plays quite a significant role in Africa. There are questions of governance. China needs to be engaged so that in the way contracts are concluded, in the way development aid is spent that contributes to governments and doesn't undermine it.
But wherever wherever you go, as a rule, you see European Union being #1 trade partner, #1 foreign investor. If not #1, then definitely not lower than #2. So let's make sure that it's also reflected in the quality and in the political influence of the European Union.
But there is it's a good illustration of how Europe, when it wants to have leverage, needs to be integrated. Because when it comes to trade relations with China, more often than not, European countries are in competition with each other. I mean, actually, it's corporations, but countries see that as, their corporations, although it's less and less true economically, but that's the perception. And so it's very difficult to have real leverage and influence if you are competing with yourself. And that is an area where the Europeans should get more integrated.
Not very surprisingly, when we talk about the future European order, we see that Europe does not only have to chew gum and walk at the same time, but it has to chew gum, walk, restructure, renegotiate, integrate, further integration, enlarge, build bridges, deal with simultaneous crises at the same time, and be still a global player. And that's just mentioning a few. I know that there's still many questions in the auditory, and I'm sorry that I have to finish it here, but let me thank our panelists here. I think they deserved a round of applause. Thank you very much. Thank you.